Starving the beast.
He can't see that.
3 decades of a well-fed federal leviathan. Well, it's an economic ideal, usually associated with the right-wing Republican American kind of ideology of economic discipline. Donald Trump has obviously come into office and he started his 100-day plan. His 100-day plan sets off $3.4 trillion in taxes over in the next decade, and that will be obviously surmounting to the growing debt crisis on the $19.4 trillion debt that America is currently experiencing. So right now, America is currently facing low consumer spending rates and is what you probably call an economic turmoil. So the past decade, the growing amount of government spending, government expenditures, has been increasing. And 30 years ago, Republicans introduced an idea to stop this and combat this. It's called starving the beast. Now the beast, I would probably introduce is what some would call the size of government, but what many would call big funding programs which America is required to pay by law, such as Medicaid, Medicare, pretty much social welfare programs like that. So they currently take up a percentage of America's GDP and that's their budget. Milton Friedman. So he's the big supporter, and Rob Barrow, big supporters of this idea of starving the beast. So my report prefaces that tax cuts do not inherently restrict government spending in the United States. And this is for a multitude of reasons, as I'll follow. So Ronald Reagan introduced this, I would probably say around the 1980s. Now before that there was a commission called the US Finance Committee, and they had a talk on this growing deficit crisis that they were experiencing. And it's been around for a while. But Alan Greenspan kind of spoke, and I'd say that in my research, he's probably the first Republican to articulate this publicly, the Republican Party's views for starving the beast. And he said, reduce the momentum of expenditure growth by restraining the amount of revenue available and trust there is a political deficit spending reduced. Now this is rhetoric has been spewed for the next 30 years and has resulted in, again, a massive debt crisis. Now, this would probably be the best example and best articulated analogy expressed by Ronald Reagan. We can lecture our children about the extravagance until we run out of breath, or we can cure their extravagance by simply reducing their allowance. Decisions on spending are mandated by the Appropriations Committee in the United States, whereas revenues, and federal revenues, like namely tax, are controlled by a Ways and Means Committee. Theoretically, under starving the beast, these two committees would be forced to work together to ensure that the government could actually continue to operate because of these starved revenues. What has actually occurred is a little bit different. In the 3 decades since, obviously deficits have increased, as spending has increased, and a growing debt has amounted. Namely foreign debt, 2/4 of America's debt is actually foreign owned by other countries, and the other one-third is actually owned within the nation, so publicly. What would be apparent through my research is that as the beast hasn't seemed to got any smaller, and that's very clear with the fact that spending's been increasing. 1980, Ronald Reagan introduced one of the biggest, probably some of the biggest tax cuts in history. He did follow up with cutting back some of them back, about half of them, but in any case, that is the outlays or the expenditure of the federal government as it followed. Now, as we go on, we can see the inauguration of George Bush Sr., who, that's really good, didn't want to actually, he actually was quoted as saying, read my lips, no new taxes. And then when the Democratic Congress went up to him and said, no new taxes, and we're not reducing our spending, it was a bit of a kerfuffle. So he actually tried to reduce spending, and through executive orders, he's actually managed to actually directly reduce spending without introducing any new taxes. Now, Clinton gets in. Clinton was good at this. Clinton mandated and under a Democratic Congress was able to introduce many new taxes and alleviate some of the outlays which could not be, or the revenues which were lost through the Reagan era. Now, Clinton actually reached a budgetary surplus. Our time, I think that's probably a testament to just the this kind of effectiveness, that he raised revenues while cutting spending, which I should probably mention will be the kind of antithesis of what I would explain as the best way of reducing federal spending. I must explain, starving the beast is a supply-siders sort of view of economics. Now, supply-siders hold the belief that we're in the powers less by the consumer but by the producers and the suppliers that mandate demand or aggregate demand. So when they cut back and deregulate certain aspects of businesses, as we see in America, there's heavy deregulations that are very less regulated than Australian markets, but also we see less and less taxes over there. We can see this kind of ethos coming in, and that's supply side. That's a supply side of kind of theory. Milton Friedman sort of suggested it. Sort of the opposite. If you've ever heard of Keynesian theory doubts this. Keynesian theory also talks about the consumer demand, and it's what the consumer wants, which kind of controls the prices and demand. This can reaffirm what I've just talked about. So, deficit, 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 deficit's in red. Now it's a lot of deficit. Now this Bill Clinton in 1993 gets elected, deficit seems to go up. Seems to be quite a nice, healthy surplus, which is all what we'd like to see in a good budget. And then George Bush gets in and it goes down again. Republican. And anyway, so George Bush pioneered again. I mentioned this. George Bush didn't really reduce spending. He went to a war, and and namely also cut good couple $1 trillion out of to big businesses. Now I'll follow this with a really interesting slide. This is the human costs that we account for. This is income drains, and this is a really interesting thing to look at. Now, you might not be able to see it because it's just so small. So the blue is the bottom 90%. Now this is their wage growth. So between 1980, when this kind of ideal was introduced, mainly into the mainstream of politics, we've been around there floating a little bit before that, but now it's really in there. It's 2008. Average US incomes grew by $11,000, right? The richest 10% of American high society, the richest echelons, you would say, to about 98% of that growth, while the bottom 90% shared about 2% of that wage growth. And that's why you'll see right down the bottom, since 1917 to about 2008, average incomes seem to have sort of flatlined. Now, look at the top 1% here, actually. You've got the top 5, top 10, they've been doing a little bit. Top 1% from, that's about $3,000 from 1917 to about $1.4 million is the average income since about 100 years. That's pretty good. That's pretty good, and that's all the top 1%. I feel like this is definitely indicative of just how the tax cuts have actually been affecting the American economy. Now you say, this could be because of the growth, just how amazing the American economy is, or it's because how much they're actually in tax, which is very low, because that's how we like to tax them. Now you can even notice drops, when Reagan era, so during the 2000s, when taxes actually started to affect the richer echelons, their income went down because we were taxing them fairly, if you wish. And then obviously Bush has got in and it's gone up again. Nice healthy profits. So Christian and David D. Romer, they were actually a really interesting couple they interviewed for my assignment, and they actually authored a report that I read. So I contacted them by email, and Christina responded, not David. And they kind of theorised about 3 different types of ways taxes affect revenue, or revenue to the federal government. And they said expenditure is determined with little regard for taxes, therefore they don't react to tax cuts. Tax cuts starve the government of revenues, thus strain government expenditure, starving the beast. Tax cuts increase expenditure. Those are the 3 mainstream theories, and really the only 3 options for what tax cuts actually do to revenue. When I was talking to them, they did find they looked at 4 episodes in American history since World War II where tax cuts have been introduced. Now what they found was, when these tax cuts were introduced, spending went unaffected. There was actually 2 instances in which spending actually increased. Now, when I talked to Christina, she said that there was caveats in this report that she felt like she couldn't conclusively say that, I'll quote this, "It is not possible to conclude that cuts do not restrain expenditure. However, we found no evidence of starving the beast effective." What I further read in the report by the Berkeley Institute was that when they actually analysed these decisions, that the Appropriations Committee, as I mentioned before, and the Ways and Means Committee, weren't actually interacting during when these tax cuts were actually being introduced. Again, sort of indicative of the effects not actually being felt by the government in power. Now, you can look at these theories of the Kemp-Roth proposal, and you can look at Proposition 13 and Buchanan's public choice theory, which were interesting to say. They all theorise tax cuts being the ultimate way forward. And I mean, you look at the proponents of starving the beast, and they argue that because of when we had these Bush, Congress in this spending straitjacket, that in fact, because of SGB's underlying flaw that it doesn't actually enforce too much discipline, and again, the biggest fault I would say with US spending as a whole is a problem with the fact that deficit spending is allowed to occur. Now I'm going to explain to a new thing about you guys, it's called deficit spending. Pretty much when you see all those deficits, that's when the spending of the economy is allowed to go past how much revenue the government's actually receiving. When I looked at this, in periods when surpluses have occurred, it's because in conjunction, spending cuts occur, taxes increase, and that is what you'd expect standard to happen. More money is with the government. Now, the theory that the free market can actually catch up with these, and when you introduce tax cuts, these tax cuts pay for themselves through economic growth, it's sort of been disputed when the tax revenues actually haven't been brought in within a decade. And that's what Roma found, that these tax cuts weren't actually paying for themselves. Money just wasn't coming in, and the tax pool, which is supposedly increases according to the Laffer curve, which when you decrease taxes, growth occurs. Well, that wasn't actually occurring, per se. No money was a really interesting character. But again, he theorised, upon reading this report, and he theorised the last part, that tax cuts actually increase expenditures. Now, whether he successfully convinced everyone is still up to debate, obviously. But his main view that was conservatives and libertarians are convinced that tax cuts are the only way to actually properly control spending. And that's incorrect. And we find that tax cuts are being introduced as the only fiscal control on spending. Even Milton Friedman, who initially supported this, now actually worries that this is actually occurring. And now that because of this theory that was introduced, the sole plan of any government is to cut taxes. So growth will occur, and we will have less money, so we can stop spending it, and deficits will disappear. So starving the beast has sought to starve the federal beast, this beast of revenue, right? It will starve the food of the beast. Revenue being the food, and beast being the government. And what we found was what I found and what many others have found is that because the fact that governments are allowed to just borrow money, that's by fault of how appropriations and Ways and Means committees are set up, because it's now that the beast, now that it has liabilities and law that force governments to spend this money, now we found that the beast can just turn around and start eating us, and the money's going to run out. And that's what many are theorising now, is that once we reach a fiscal cliff, money's gone, the interest that we pay on the money that we borrow exceeds how much money we actually have, the fiscal cliff, then all chaos breaks loose.